Bougainville's ongoing move for independence from Papua New Guinea has been at an impasse for decades. The latest promising development has been up in the air for the last 5 years.
Bougainville's quest for independence from Papua New Guinea has been put on the back burner, with the PNG government putting off the tabling of the independence referendum.
Even the popes told PNG to get a move on.
The Pope urged leaders to progress discussions over the future of the autonomous region of Bougainville, saying the rekindling of ancient tensions must be avoided. Bougainville voted overwhelmingly to secede from PNG in 2019, but since then, PNG's government has dragged its feet, missing last year's deadline to vote on ratifying the non-binding referendum result.
Now, a potential breakthrough.
Papua New Guinea has agreed to a Bougainville government request for a moderator to be brought in to solve an impasse as the autonomous region seeks independence. Bougainville wanted a working moderator to resolve a dispute over how their referendum on independence would be tabled in the PNG Parliament.
And New Zealand looks set to play a pivotal role, with General Sir Jerry Mataparai called in to help mediate.
Sir Jerry understands the Polynesian and the Melanesian way. It's within his DNA. And he'll know there'll be a lot of time spent with people face to face, just listening and listening, and probing for the points that he could capitalise on to get them closer together. I'm not going to try and prejudge it, but if anyone can develop a solution from these people, Sir Jerry's got a good chance of doing so.
That's our former Foreign Minister, Sir Don McKinnon, who was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for his role in brokering a deal in Christchurch that ended the Bougainville Civil War. And while this part of the Pacific might seem far away to most of us, New Zealand has played a central role in its recent history, and continues to do so. I'm Gwen McClure, and today on The Detail, a 101 on the past, present, and possible future of this region. Sir Don will run us through the history, but first, the basics. Papua New Guinea is a Melanesian country just north of Australia. Its mainland shares an island with West Papua, which is, controversially, an Indonesian province. The autonomous region of Bougainville is part of PNG, but a separate island to the southeast of PNG's mainland. And Bougainville would like to be a separate country, too. Here's RNZ Pacific journalist Don Wiseman.
Papua New Guinea's enormously diverse. It's got more than 800 language groups, and there were more. It's lost a few language groups over the last 100 years or so. There's not a huge amount of national feeling. I think that's growing. It's they're trying to work to develop it, but for Bougainville, it's more cohesive, I think. There are divisions within that, but clearly not as many as there are in the wider Papua New Guinea context. And it's a very big country, Papua New Guinea. It's double the size, I think, of New Zealand. And Bougainville itself is quite substantial. Think about the size of Samoa, for instance, but a long way from the mainland.
And what is the political relationship? When did Bougainville become an autonomous region?
There was the Bougainville peace agreement signed. It was a big deal back in 2001.
Singing in harmony for the first time in nearly a decade. After 10 days of negotiation at a second round of peace talks, the Bougainville rebels and officials from the government of Papua New Guinea stood side by side, agreed on terms for peace.
It is important that we return to Bougainville and give something to our people.
We have, I feel, taken another step in the right direction towards bringing peace and lasting political settlement to Bougainville.
And that set up, or made an allowance for an autonomous government. That came into being for the first time in 2005, so it's now run for 19 years and been fairly successful, but I don't think they've had a lot of money to play with, so that's curtailed a lot of their activities. There has been a gradual devolution of powers from central government to them, but at this point there's still a fair number, I think, of those powers still to come through because there's a lack of capacity still within the Bougainville government.
Papua New Guinea gained independence from Australia in 1975. In their history, they've been colonized or occupied by Britain, Germany, and Japan, too. And Bougainville's current relationship with PNG is largely a product of that colonization. Here's Sir Don McKinnon.
The colonial powers drew a line, and Bougainville should have gone with the Solomons and Vanuatu.
And does Bougainville still feel like it's part of the Solomons, or it feels
they're first cousins still, and the Vanuatu as well.
So would they prefer to be part of Vanuatu or the Solomons?
Well,
or no,
I wouldn't say so now. Okay. I mean, they've gone through all these other dramas wanting to be independent. I mean, could they be independent? I've never advocated for independency because it is just a hugely costly exercise. I've always said get the maximum autonomy you can from Papua New Guinea.
What does that actually look like, though?
Well, it's governing as much as possible for as much as you can, which goes right into your infrastructure, health and education, okay? But it also means that you've got to get a kind of a revenue cut from the government in Moresby. Now, at one time, the government in Moresby got 80% of their funds from the mine in Bougainville, the Panguna mine. That's vastly different now because they've got oil and gas reserves and that sort of thing. But somehow you'd have to work out a way in which they don't suffer and they don't get overpaid from being autonomous but still part of Papua New Guinea.
Okay, it gets quite complicated, doesn't it?
It does get kind of complicated, yeah. And this is what Jerry Mataparai's got to sort out.
Sir Jerry Mataparai's selection for that role isn't confirmed by the UN yet, but it's understood both sides agree he's the guy for the job. Sir Jerry was New Zealand's Governor-General and also commanded a truce monitoring group in Bougainville from the late 90s, at the end of the decade-long Bougainville Civil War, which killed some 10% of the population. Sir Don first went to PNG 8 years earlier, in 1991, but it was in 1994 when he first visited Bougainville.
What I saw at first hand was just shocking. Going into Arawa, which was a care centre where Bougainvillians were supposed to be safe and getting fed. I don't think they were getting fed. I could see people who were clearly starving and absolutely fearful of their lives. And the more I moved around that little town of Arawa, which is really the capital of Bougainville, I suppose, the more I saw this. And I was with a couple of other members of Parliament from New Zealand. I had a little team with me, and I came away thinking, this should not be happening. This is in our home region. This has been going on now for, 7 or 8 years. We've got to change our policy and get involved somehow. And I didn't have a blueprint in my mind, but I knew we had to be involved. We had to do something to try and stop this war.
And let's back up for a second and talk about what that war was about and who the players were.
The players were a core of Bougainvillians who felt that they had been absolutely shortchanged by the Papua New Guinean government in terms of the value of copper that was coming out of the Panguna mine. Now, a number of these Bougainvillians actually worked for the mining company. This is Rio Tinto. And therefore, they kind of knew what was going on. So they got pretty annoyed, not partly at Rio Tinto, but more appropriately at the government in Waigani, because they just weren't getting the benefit on Bougainville for what was coming out of the mine. So a lot of agitation built up, and then the secessionist movement started with Francis Ona as the president of the secessionist movement. It became the Bougainville interim government, they called themselves. He was the president of that, then developed the BRA, the Bougainville Revolutionary Army, under Sam Kaona. So you built up quite a force of people who were determined to have independence for Bougainville and clearly went to war against those who did not accept that thesis.
And then it got a bit more complicated than that, right? Because there were also different factions within Bougainville?
Once this attempt to break away began, Bougainville peoples broke up into a number of different sectors. And depending on which sector you were in, whether you'd be the enemy of another sector. And of course, once this happened, And the Papua New Guinean government was totally against what was happening. So the Papua New Guinean Defence Forces were on the island trying to sustain law and order, but at the same time had in their sights members of the Bougainville Revolutionary Army. And many were shot, many were killed. And so were many soldiers killed by the Revolutionary Army. So you could never get a point where all the Bougainvillean leaders would be in one place at the one time on Bougainville. They were too fearful of being blown up.
And then what year was it when things really started to move on getting to this peace deal? And tell me a bit about that, going to Christchurch.
Well, it did take a while. We just had to somehow get to the key players of the Bougainville interim government and the Bougainville Revolutionary Army and somehow work out a way to get them off the island. This took a while to develop, and of course these things cost money too, and when you're pleading with the finance minister for a few million for something like this, you know you're going to get a lot of questions. But don't forget, I didn't really want to totally alienate the Australians. They were carrying a big load. Their aid program to Papua New Guinea is enormous. And I didn't want to be sort of looking as though New Zealand were a little bunch of smarties doing something that maybe the Australians would like to do. But the Australian relationship with Papua New Guinea has always been different. It's an unhappy marriage, and they can never get divorced. They are just too close together and totally codependent.
That opened the door for New Zealand to play a role.
The better part of 1995, they were still having these meetings at various places, and again, not all the right people turned up. So consequence, they'd go away and the understanding and the agreement would fall apart. They'd start to plan for another one. And it wasn't until mid-1996 that I and my people were making progress, talking to the BRA people and the BIG people, saying, look, we believe we can play a part. Somehow we've got to get you to New Zealand. So I knew we had to talk to a greater number of people. We had to get them off the island and give them time and more time to sort themselves out.
So how did that play out? When did you get everyone off the island?
Well, we had a number of clandestine meetings here in New Zealand with some Bougainvilleans who were key players. So we got them here, we talked to them for 3 days, we worked out a plan, and we sent them all home again. And then I sent them a plan to say, listen, why don't we just bring about 30 or 40 of you to New Zealand, and we will have meetings here. We're not going to try and rush you, and hopefully you, the Bougainvilleans, can come to a common position. And ultimately they said yes to that. And that's when we then put in place with our Air Force, with our Navy, that we would do a series of pickups of Bougainvillean people all over the island and ferry them out to some place where bigger aircraft were and get them down to New Zealand.
And that didn't go entirely smoothly, right? John Hayes' helicopter?
John Hayes' helicopter got shot at, and of course I got word of this, and I was in a cabinet committee meeting at the time, and I got called out and say the helicopter's been shot at. I thought, oh my goodness. But everyone's okay. Do we continue, Minister? I said, well, what does Hayes think? Hayes thinks we should continue. I said, all right, we continue, but don't talk about this. Just keep it to yourselves. And we continued.
John Hayes, who was the former High Commissioner to PNG, was determined the talks wouldn't be derailed, and he played the incident down.
The surprising thing was, of course, when it came to bringing 30 or 40 people to New Zealand, those 30 or 40 people ended up by being 70 or 80 people. There were more people to be picked up, including one we picked up by accident who wasn't even supposed to come from New Zealand. He was supposed to go to a hospital in Booker, but he was lucky. He ended up in Christchurch Hospital.
The meeting that followed was called Burnham 1. Sir Don took a cue from former U.S. Secretary of State Warren Christopher on how to get warring parties together.
And he said, well, I decided the one way to get through this, I'm going to put all these people on an Air Force base in Ohio, and I'm going to lock the gates. I'm going to give them all the booze they want, and they got to stay there until they reach a solution. And I thought, now that's a pretty good idea.
So the gates of the Burnham military camp were locked and soldiers posted there.
We had serious soldiers nearby because, after all, some of these people had killed other people. Would they continue killing them in Burnham camp? No, thank goodness. But nevertheless, it worked very well. And then they said, well, can we have can we have another meeting here in Burnham with the Papua New Guinea government? I said, yes. Can we have it next week? I said, no, you've got to go home and sell the story first. And I didn't want to put too much pressure on it. I wanted them to go home and tell the story and feel enthusiastic about coming back with a comprehensive story of their own. So I pushed out the Burnham 2 meeting to October. And the idea of Burnham 2 was obviously an agreement between the Bougainvillean people and the Papua New Guinean government.
Eventually, the negotiations led to a peace agreement in 2001. But Bougainville didn't get independence. They got autonomy.
They developed an interim autonomy arrangement, which in a way is still there. They were talking about having a referendum. And only just a few years before, Prime Minister Rocard of France had intervened in the sort of dispute in New Caledonia between the Kanaki people and the white population. And once he had settled it down, he said, why don't we have a referendum in 10 years' time, give you time to think about it. So I suggest that for Bogue. Why not just get what you can now, but then have a referendum in 10 years' time when everyone knows what's going on. And as long as you're still peaceful, you'll get a reasonable solution. And then we got to the end of 10 years and it was extended for another 10 years. And that sort of truncates a whole lot of time.
Yeah, and was it relatively peaceful in that time?
It pretty much was. From time of Burnham 1, it became fairly peaceful. There were occasional, a shooting here or a stabbing here, but they were, the Bougainvillean people were keen to tell me, that's a one-off, that's just a robbery gone wrong or something like that. There was no longer a direct conflict because they were holding out hope that if they played their cards right, a referendum would give them the right answer, and therefore serious talks with the Papua New Guinean government.
In 2019, they finally had that referendum. Here's Don Wiseman.
It was going to be a non-binding referendum, but the people of Bougainville very much got behind it. There were some who were diffident at best about this idea of being independent from PNG, but people generally fell into line, and it was 97.7% in favour of independence from PNG. The nature of that independence hasn't been defined. It could be whatever gradation you might get of independence.
Can you tell me more about that level of autonomy, what it actually looks like practically?
It doesn't amount to a great deal, to be honest. The place is treated differently than other parts of Papua New Guinea. They are meant to eventually have full control over police, but they don't yet. They don't have any say in terms of foreign affairs or any ability to deal officially with the outside world, although there is in fact significant involvement of the UN within Bougainville. In terms of fisheries, which is hugely important, there's not yet full control over Bougainville fisheries, and there's no marine zone that's been established. That is their marine zone.
Okay, so that referendum, the result was overwhelmingly for independence, but obviously that doesn't change things overnight. So what has happened in the past 5 years?
That referendum was non-binding, so like a nice to have, but in the end may not necessarily mean much, especially if you happen to be part of the government in Port Moresby. Since then, there has been probably an increasingly strident call for Bougainville to have its independence. A couple of years ago, the government came out and said, we expect to be independent by 2025. Or 2027 at the latest. They have threatened to do this unilaterally if there's no agreement from Port Moresby. But a unilateral move is probably going to get them nowhere, so I'd say they're very reluctant to do that.
And what about Papua New Guinea? Why doesn't it necessarily want to lose Bougainville?
Oh, loss of face, and also there's potentially a lot of wealth, I guess. In Bougainville, the Panguna mine, there is talk of it being reopened, which is what the Bougainville government certainly wants, and gazillions of dollars of gold and copper still in there. There are other mines there as well. There's the large fishery, tourism potential, you name it.
What happens now? Where does Sir Jerry come into this?
Well, they reached a bit of a stalemate. The referendum was meant to be tabled in the PNG Parliament last year, in the last session of last year's Parliament, and that would have allowed then MPs to learn about the matter and consider votes ahead of just how the country would react to what the people of Bougainville had said they want. But it never got tabled. And then Port Moresby changed the rules. As far as Bougainville is concerned, they changed the rules and said that for this measure to be tabled, they would need an absolute majority of MPs to support it, which infuriated Bougainville, who said, look, to just get this into the Parliament, you just need a simple majority of MPs. And this has held them up until this point. And they decided earlier in the year that a moderator should be brought in to try and bridge the gap. And it's taken them until now to find a suitable moderator. And Jerry Mataparai will no doubt be ideal for it. He's very familiar with Bougainville. He's spent a lot of time there and was highly regarded during his time there. And he's well regarded by Port Moresby as well. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens next. But I would imagine that these matters are going to get resolved and it will get into the Parliament, and then they can look toward ratification of it.
So you do expect that Bougainville will get its independence?
I think it's hard to say. There are a lot of people in the PNG Parliament who have very strident opinions against that idea. There are a lot of people in the PNG Parliament, I understand, who actually don't know what the issues are. You know, the Civil War was something that happened, began more than 30 years ago. Yeah, a lot of people are not as informed about it as perhaps they should be, and Bougainville wants to ensure that there's a process to inform MPs from around the country about what the issues are and what it is that Bougainville is looking for.
To get that independence, you really do want to have a consent from the country that you want to be independent from. I think Sam Koona, who was head of the Bougainville Revolutionary Army, put it very clearly to me when he said, look, we don't want to get independence at the point of a gun because they are bigger than us. And in 3 years' time, they could come and just put a blockade around the island and starve us out again. We don't want that. We want to get a consensual level of independence. I was there 3 years ago, and I was keen to meet a lot of the people in Moresby. I was keen to get to Bougainville too. And the people in Moresby were still sort of, well, we're not too sure what we're going to do. We don't want to give them independence. But on the other hand, we can sort of understand their pleas for a high level of autonomy. Can you help us? I said, well, anything you think I can do, I'm prepared to do. And I did spend a bit of time there talking to people with, in fact, another guest of theirs, former Prime Minister of Ireland, Bertie Ahern. And he and I had a few chats during our time there to see if we could sort anything out. But there was a huge gap between the two. And I think those who thought of the idea of asking General Mataparai to go was a good idea.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production funded by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was engineered by Phil Benge and produced by Alexia Russell. Thank you to Don Wiseman and Sir Don McKinnon. I'm Gwen McClure, Mā te wā.